wisdom. Empowerment. Urban Family Talk.
Let's talk about the red tape in retreat. This is good news, isn't it?
I think it is. We're seeing fewer new regulations being issued, and we've seen some significant regulations rushed out at the end of the last administration actually overturned.
So first, before we get into the details, which I'm very excited about, and I have been covering this a bit on the program, but it's great to have an expert like yourself on to really help us to unpack this. My primary question that I want to start off with has to do with why this is good. So a lot of people that I interact with, like, in your regular life, when you say, well, President Trump's reducing regulations, they're like, so what? Who cares? That's government stuff. What's he doing for me? How does this reduction in regulations actually impact regular Americans?
I think that's a great question, and I agree. I talk to people who think of regulations as something that maybe costs businesses but protects them. But actually, less regulation would mean more competition, a more vibrant and innovative economy that's better for everybody. All of us would be more prosperous. We don't realize just how many regulations affect our daily life. There's actually an interesting new project that you and your viewers might like. It's called the Regulatory Transparency Project of the Federalist Society, and it walks through some of that, what different regulations are and what their real impact is.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. So in your piece, you have a piece on Forbes.com, which will be in my Twitter feed at the next break, everybody, if you want to read it, and also on the Facebook page. It's under the heading Cutting Red Tape. You talk about how the president, first of all, he ran on this. He talked about this on the campaign stump. As soon as he was elected and then inaugurated, he talked about on day one, for one of the first things he said was, we're going to start cutting regulations. Mm-hmm. And in the first 4 months of office, he made substantial progress, but mostly by using tools that are no longer available to him. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the Congressional Review Act allows Congress a short window of time, about 4 months, to review regulations issued over the previous 4 months, 4 to 6 months, and disapprove them. Now, Congress has had that authority since 1996. They've only used it once before, and in part it's because when they send a disapproval of a regulation to the president's desk, it's usually the very same president who issued the regulation. And in fact, they sent several to President Obama, and he vetoed them. But this was an opportunity, a perfect storm, as it were, where with a new Congress and a new president, Congress sent him, President Trump, 14 resolutions, and he signed them. And in fact, just last week, they sent another one.
Well, this is, to me, so this is the kind of, it's like this government Robert's Rules of Order type stuff that people, you're like, parliamentary procedure, I don't want to sit around and try to figure that out. But this is actually in the favor of the American people, because when you elect a new president, you're electing him to implement a new agenda. And a president who was leaving and kind of rushing through midnight regulations, he's doing that in order to thwart the incoming president's new agenda. And this basically says, we're not going to allow that. We're going to use a tool that's available to us that's legal and there's nothing underhanded about it to eliminate these unnecessary regulations.
That's right. It allows the people who are elected, so the people who are responsible and accountable to the American citizens, to say, no, that's not what we meant. We don't want to go forward with that, and just overturn it.
Okay, so then you go on in the piece to talk about slowing the pace of new rules. And so 8 months into the Trump administration, in your piece, it says the orders appear to have slowed the pace of new regulations. And it talks about the latest regulatory agenda, which is published twice a year, and that the entire number of regulations under development have fallen by 1/3. So looking forward, with fewer regulations, will the government still be able to operate efficiently? Will it still be able to get the things done it needs to get done?
Yes. So this is separate from government operations. Regulations really are things that the government imposes on everybody else, companies, individuals, workers, et cetera, things that we can and can't do. So, yes, one of the things the president did early on was say, we have too many regulations. We never look back at that accumulated the pile of regulations that have accumulated over the decades. So for every new regulation we issue, we're going to find two that are no longer working and eliminate them. And we're going to make sure that costs don't continue to creep up, the cost to all of us of paying for these regulations. To ensure that, we're going to, my agencies have to find regulations that are imposing costs and remove costs equivalent to any new costs we put on through new regulations. So,
which
and that
I'm loving that.
Yeah, it's so presidents have all agreed for the last 30 years that we should only issue regulations if they have benefits that exceed costs. And regulations do provide benefits as well as costs. The problem is it's the agencies that are estimating whether there are benefits greater than costs. And they don't have a budget constraint. They can just impose whatever regulations they think look good without that constraint, that discipline that all of us face in every other aspect of our lives. And so for the first time, he has said, go ahead, continue to make sure regulations are providing benefits, but at the same time, you have a budget constraint to work with. So what that's done so far is slowed the pace of new regulations, but actually overturning regulations, aside from that window that we've talked about working with Congress, it's not easy. There are all the procedures that agencies have to go through to implement a regulation in the first place. They have to do in reverse to remove it. And as you know, there's a lot of litigation. There will always be litigation over that. So it will take some time, and agencies will have to be very careful to make sure that they do the analysis and prepare a rulemaking docket that supports their decisions.
So one example of what you're just kind of alluding to there by saying how difficult it is and the lawsuits and all of that is covered in your piece under Steering the Administrative State. And you talk about the EPA's announcement in April that it would review the Clean Power Plan, which I was rejoicing. I was like, yes, because that's only meant to impose these carbon emissions regulations that are like unattainable on us. And we already are the cleanest nation on the planet when it comes to controlling emissions and regulating polluters, all those things. We're the leading edge on that type of technology and just the laws that we have here. But this Clean Power Plan actually exceeds the statutory authority that Congress has provided in the Clean Air Act. Can you explain this one to everybody? Because it looks like it's going to be tough to get rid of.
It may be, although I think the courts have weighed in and raised some questions about it, so EPA has that on its side. And this gets exactly to that point I was making of all the steps, as you said. So EPA has just recently released a proposal saying, here's what we plan to do to unwind this regulation that has been issued, but it isn't in effect yet. So the costs of that rule have yet to hit, and so it's not too late to try to unwind it. But it will take time, and it will take very careful analysis and economic analysis, but also legal analysis and scientific analysis about what really are the effects. As you say, will it really reduce carbon emissions, or will they just shift them to other countries where, to the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where that carbon is emitted, if it's in the U.S. or in China. So if we're shipping all our manufacturing to China, we're still going to have all the problems with climate change that this rule is supposed to be reducing.
So how do we get rid of those? I know that's the first thing I always think of when I'm listening to, someone like yourself speaking about this. How do we get rid of those?
Well, the first step is to develop a record that explains why this administration thinks that the previous administration's analysis and justification was wrong. And EPA has done that step, and that is now out for public comment. So anyone can now file comments with EPA and either support or oppose or offer alternative information related to this new justification, which says we don't need to go as far as the Obama EPA went. EPA will evaluate those comments, and then they will issue a final regulation, and at that point, the lawsuits will all begin.
Well, I'm glad we have you on top of this, because this is like, it's almost too complex for regular people who have all this other stuff to do to really wrap their minds around. But suffice it to say, we at least have an EPA administrator who is on the side of the American people. We have a president who's committed to reducing regulations and simplifying all of these things. And it's going to be a battle, but I do believe they have the resolve to get it done.
Well, I like your optimism.
I have no choice.
If I have another minute, let me just reinforce that point that you made, and that is that most of us in our daily lives just don't have the time. We're too busy taking care of our kids and our jobs. We don't have the time to be filing comments on these regulations, digging into the thousands of pages of analysis. So it is only the big special interests that do have the incentives and ability to do that. And that's why the regulatory system is so broken. So I agree with you. I think some cleaner rules, simplifying, fewer regulations, more reliance on competition in private markets could go a long way to restoring the vigor of the American economy.
Well, I can't wait. I'm going to keep believing in it. I have to, because it's almost like one of those movies where the people have papers stacked up on a spiral staircase and it's inside a governmental building, and people come in and try to get like just something simple. And it's in, it's in the olden days before cars, and the people come in and try to get help, and they're told that they need to come back on the 5th Tuesday of the 4th month of the lunar year, and then when you come, you have to bring your papers in quintuplet, and they have to be signed by your great grandfather's uncle on their, mother's side, something like that. And the people always leave and they look confused, and you feel enraged in that moment, but it's meant to mock excessive government. And really the government is kind of like that, even though it's ridiculous because we don't stack papers. We don't file papers on spiral staircases, but you get my meaning. It actually is kind of like that.
Yeah, it's the small entrepreneurs that just can't get through it, and the larger incumbents, they have the infrastructure to do it.
And that's not the way the founders intended this thing to work.
Right.
So
right.
Thank you so much, Susan. Your work on Forbes is fantastic. You're Susan E. Dudley on Twitter, at Susan E. Dudley. And the Forbes piece is now in my Twitter feed. You can go to @StacyOnTheRight, click on the link, and you can read this piece. It's not lengthy, but it's packed with details that we should inform ourselves of if we want to help the president and Administrator Pruitt get through this morass to try to reduce regulations so small businesses can do what they need to do. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thanks a lot, Stacy.
Truth. We're about wisdom. We're about empowerment. Urban Family Talk.